behalf of Ed Steele, Chairman and CEO of EAS Consulting Group, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Unraveling the Impact of FSMA on Acidified Food Regulations. EAS specializes in FDA regulatory matters with a prime focus of assisting domestic and foreign food, pharmaceutical, dietary supplement, medical device, cosmetics, and tobacco firms comply with applicable laws and regulations. EAS is staffed with former FDA and compliance and inspection officials and industry executives, and is assisted by an extensive network of consultants with many years of FDA and industry experience. Today's presenters are Priya Rathnam, a Consumer Safety Officer at FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, and EAS Consulting Group's independent consultant, Dr. Omar Oyarzabal, who is a microbiologist and professor at the University of Vermont. And I apologize for messing up your last name. Today's webinar will cover a brief history of low acid food and acidified food regulations, the definition of acidified foods and key terms used in acidified food regulations, the importance of recording critical factors, a summary of recent FDA inspections of large size and medium size acidified food facilities, and an opportunity for improvements based on observations from FDA inspections. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may ask any questions of our presenters by typing them into the chat box. And with that, I will say thank you again for joining EAS and FDA, and I'll turn the presentation over to Omar and Priya.
Thank you, Amy. Let's start briefly by reviewing some of the reasons why we have this focusing mainly on acidified foods, which appear after low acid foods regulation were implemented in this country. These regulations go back to the 1970s, and the main hazard of concern have been the control of Clostridium botulinum, which is a very important biological hazard when manufacturing acidified foods. We know that this pathogen produces toxins that are one of the most potent toxins that we know on humans, and can grow under anaerobic conditions in products that are hermetically sealed if the pH of the product is about 4.6 or above that. So let's define briefly what is the definition of acidified foods, and let's talk about some of the terms used in acidified food regulations. Acidified foods are defined as low acid foods to which acids or acid foods are added. This product has a water activity of 0.85 or above and a finished equilibrium pH that is equal or below 4.6. We need to remember that there are many food products that have a natural pH that is below 4.6. And all these products fall within a category called acid foods. Sometimes you will hear some people calling them or referring them to naturally acid foods or food ingredients. These food products are not covered by regulations. There are many different types of acidified food products. Basically, it is fair to say that acidified foods are found throughout the whole spectrum of the different food categories that we have, including vegetables, meat, bakery products, etc. So I'm going to try now to define again, give the definition of acidified food using the pH scale. If you go into that pH scale and you focus on this traditional value of 4.6, we see that that's the value that has been used, the pH value used to differentiate, to separate low acid foods versus acid foods, okay? In the case of acidified food, we are talking about food that have low acid food ingredients or components that are mixed with either acid food and or acid in order to bring it to a pH below 4.6. This pH 4.6 is the pH at which below that Clostridium botulinum, the spores of Clostridium botulinum, will not germinate, and therefore there will not be any vegetative cells that may eventually produce those toxins. The way we determine the whether an acidified food product or a food product is acidified or not is a little bit complex. In here is where we use the term processing authority, that is somebody with the training to evaluate the formulation of the product, picking up that product. We also go through the process schedule that includes all the manufacturing processes that the products and the ingredients will go through. We also analyze and evaluate the finish equilibrium pH, and also the pH shift that may happen or is needed in order to ensure that all the components within the finished food have a finish equilibrium pH below 4.6. Basically, we are trying to manufacture food that fit within this definition of commercial sterility or shelf-stable food. That is a food that doesn't have any viable vegetative cells of microorganisms of public health significance that are known or predicted to be associated with particular ingredients and foods, or a microorganisms that can multiply in the food under normal non-refrigerating condition of storage of distribution. There is a portal. In this slide, you can see that there is a portal on the website of the Food and Drug Administration for the registration of a facility that manufactures acidified food. Through this portal, the industry can submit the filing processes in an electronic way. And some of you may be familiar with it because probably you are in charge of keeping up with the account that they are also, filing and submitting those filings electronically. Okay. I'm just mentioning that because on the last, 8 to 10 years, we have been moving into electronic submission of these filings. One area that I would like to emphasize is the importance of keeping records related to critical factors. Let's define first critical factors. These are those parameters or conditions that must be met to ensure that we produce a shelf-stable product, okay? And those conditions are determined, as we said, by the processing authority that reviews the formulations, the schedule process, and the different conditions necessary to determine what are the parameters for safety for that product. It's very important that we remember that these critical factors must be measured and recorded at a sufficient frequency to ensure that those critical factors are within the limits that have been established for safety reasons, okay? Also keep in mind that if there is a process deviation because some of those critical factors were not met, we are within corrective actions. We need to start corrective actions. In the next couple of slides, I will summarize some of the findings from FDA inspections of large size and medium sized facilities. I went through the FDA website, and got some of the information that has been posted over the years from the different observations that FDA inspectors have been finding when they inspect different facilities. Okay, and I'm going to focus primarily on this about 10 years period that is covering from October of 2008 until early this year, March 2017. And what I came up with is a couple of tables. You are seeing here on slide number 23, the first table, where I'm trying to put in there the top citation, and I call top citation those that have more than 100 times has been cited. And I try to put the number that we have on the right column, and on the left one, the 21 CFR violation. We are referring to Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 114. That is the one capturing acidified foods. And you can see in this slide that the maintenance of processing and production records, scheduled process, and pH testing are some of those observations that have, have been cited most. In this next slide, in slide number 24, we can see that I have continued this categorization of the different citations. I would say the second tier citations that are below 100 times. And in here we have quality control procedures, container testing, product distribution, maybe incomplete or missing information on processing and production, records related to process deviation and thermal processing, all of them with some citations. As you can see, these observations that we are highlighting show some of the deficiencies, some of them related to record keeping in relation to critical factors in these facilities. So I haven't gone into details with this analysis, but maybe in the next few weeks I'm going to try to review again some of these observations and see what else can be found. But without going into details of the different subparts within 114, we have an idea with these two slides, 23 and 24, where we have most of the issues that have been identified in these facilities. So with this brief introduction, I would like to transfer the presentation to Priya Rathnam from FDA.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Amy, and to EAS Consulting Group for inviting FDA to present at this webinar. Again, I'm Priya Rathnam, and I'm happy to provide some insights about current FSMA inspections under the cGMP and Preventive Controls Rule, or as you know, 21 CFR 117. So we'll talk about some trends we're seeing, and then again, we'll try and answer questions you may have. Slide 26, please. Okay, so for today's FSMA implementation update, we'll briefly go over the cGMP and PC rule for human food, or the PC rule implementation, go over some of the training efforts that are already underway, provide some details about FDA's inspection approach, compliance and enforcement, provide some information on guidance documents, and then how the inspections are going. Slide 27. So again, we won't spend too much time on the regulation itself, as I'm sure you're probably aware of who this regulation applies to. Again, facilities that have to register with FDA, including both foreign and domestic facilities. And as you may know, there are built-in exemptions and modified requirements. Those would apply primarily for the requirements of hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. You can see here the updated cGMPs include protection against allergen cross-contact, include provisions for human food byproduct diverted to animal food, and previously non-binding provisions such as education and training that are now binding related to training in food hygiene and safety and those related records. As you may know, LACF facilities are subject to the GMPs in Part 117, as well as to 108 and 113, and will be subject to are subject to the training requirements. Similarly, acidified food facilities are also subject to these training requirements and the updated GMPs. Slide 28. So subpart C and G include, as I mentioned, the preventive control rule requirements, which include having a written hazard analysis and, depending on the outcome of the hazard analysis, requires a written preventive control program, including process, food allergen, sanitation, supply chain, and other controls. Again, all part of the food management components for each of those programs that may apply for monitoring, corrective action, verification, and related records. And finally, a written recall plan requirement if the hazard analysis reveals a hazard that requires a PC. So, and one additional note before we go to the next slide, as you know, LACF operations are exempt with respect to the microbiological hazards addressed by Part 113, but not acidified food processors that are subject to 114. So in other words, the hazard analysis for an LACF operation may cover chemical, including radiological, and physical hazards, as well as those hazards that may be introduced for economic gain, but not the microbiological hazards, compared to acidified processors, where that would include also the microbiological hazards under 117. Common known or reasonably foreseeable hazards that would need to be addressed may include pesticides that may be present, for example, in produce, allergens present in ingredients, stones and other hard objects that may be present in raw agricultural commodities, and glass when, for example, if an LACF product is packed in glass or acidified is packed in glass. Similar hazards would apply, again, for acidified foods as with LACF. The only exception, as I mentioned, is the microbiological hazards. Slide 29. So this slide shows the staggered compliance dates based on business size that are defined in the regulation. And as you can see, we've already passed the all other business, or what we call the large business dates. Those are the businesses with 500 or more full-time equivalent employees. We began inspections of those facilities in October of last year. Next are the small business or of more than 1 million. We started those inspections in October of this year. And the last would be the very small business facilities, or what we term qualified facilities, which again need to self-attest, and that we will begin inspecting in October of 2018. So there's a separate compliance date, as you can see, for businesses under the PMO, or the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, which allowed them time to revise the PMO, and that would be October of 2018. So in summary, by October of 2018, all businesses that are subject to 117 would be required to comply. Slide 30, please. So we recognize that having trained staff is really imperative to all the work that we're doing in FDA for implementation, and we've been working really hard for several years to make sure our staff are trained. All staff involved in conducting or reviewing inspections have to first attend the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance training. That's so they have a basic understanding, and this is the FDA recognized curriculum for industry that we also have all of our staff attend with industry stakeholders. We've also provided what we call FSMA chats and FSMA rule readiness. These are discussions on topics such as food safety culture and sanitation, and we've actually included speakers from industry to help on that front. And finally, all investigators conducting inspections are actually required to complete an FDA regulator course, which is specific to how to assess against this regulation under 117. Slide 31. So in terms of inspections, our goal is to obtain industry compliance in an effort to reduce foodborne illness. FDA knows we can't use a one-size-fits-all approach to inspections, but we do know we want to spend less time in facilities that have a great track record and more time in facilities that don't. So we're training our staff to conduct what we call interactive inspections. This is in an attempt to obtain prompt voluntary corrective actions during inspections rather than trying to seek enforcement actions down the road. And we're really focusing on looking at public health significance. Again, looking at a system-based inspection approach. For example, if we find a record not being signed off, we would ask, or look at whether that's an isolated problem. If we maybe looked at 1 out of 50 records, or is it more of a systemic problem of not reviewing records? And we're also training our staff to ask more open-ended questions and participate more in a dialogue with the facility being inspected. So you may notice a lot more discussion during these PC inspections as we're training staff to really determine what a firm is doing to meet the regulatory requirements, rather than telling the firm how they aren't. Slide 32. So we work in fiscal years for work planning at FDA, which runs actually from October 1st through the following September 30th of the following year. So for fiscal year 17 inspections that started in October of 2016, we covered the other, or what we call the large business facilities in our work plan. The inspections were conducted by trained FDA staff, with states joining when possible. And the scope of the inspections were covering GMPs with what we call a broad-based overarching assessment of preventive control programs in those facilities, or a preventive controls inspection. But again, keep in mind, regardless of the scope, all inspections are being conducted under Part 117 for both domestic and foreign facilities. So only FDA staff had been conducting the inspections under 117 in that last fiscal year. But keep in mind, for fiscal year 18, some states will also be doing some FDA contract inspections under the preventive controls rule. Slide 33. So let's take a closer look at those full scope CGMP and PC inspections. As you can see, these inspections can be quite complex, spanning about a week in most cases, give or take, depending on the findings. And if swabbing is deemed needed, I can just mention one quick note about swabbing. For the most part, we try not to swab during a preventive controls inspection unless there's some history of pathogen problems, or if a firm is required to have an environmental monitoring program but does not. So again, the focus for both the GMP, for these inspections is both GMP filth issues, and as you can see on the slide, the specific requirements under the other preventive control programs I noted. One additional thing to also keep in mind is we began assessing supply chain programs this past June at facilities where their suppliers were subject to the rule. Slide 34. So in terms of our regulatory strategy, it's really to educate before and while we regulate, and take a cooperative approach to gain voluntary corrections. We know we won't be accepting what we call a Band-Aid approach to noncompliance or repeat problems that show a lack of control, provided the agency with new and broadened authorities under FSMA, which includes swift administrative tools to take action to protect the public when needed. One thing just to note on this slide is, we're ranking observations during an inspection. So what I mean by ranking is, we're really looking at public health significance to inform our regulatory strategy and our future work planning. So the rankings we use are internally are minor, major, and critical. Minor being those deficiencies that likely pose no safety risk, more of a technical noncompliance. Major, which would be deficiencies that are likely to result in a food safety risk, and perhaps also reflect a system failure. And finally, critical, those would be deficiencies that would present an imminent public health situation, what we refer to as SACOTA, a serious adverse health consequence, or death to humans and animals. So again, these are internal rankings that we use to help flag on the regulator side what certain public health situations may be and to ensure consistency. Slide 35. So some of you may be aware of our draft food hazards guide, really developed to aid in developing a hazard analysis and putting together a food safety plan. We're using it during our training and also during inspections to help understand what hazards need to be considered. Again, it's just the hazards that need to be considered, and this guide is still in draft form, but it's been a valuable tool for our inspectors doing these PC inspections. Note the first 6 chapters and a few appendices have been posted already. An additional chapter will be slide 36. Okay, here's a quick snapshot on the FDA website for the hazards guide. This page also allows you to submit comments about the draft electronically and provides information on how to submit written comments, whichever is preferred. But those written comments need to be in before the end of February of next year. Slide 37. This is just a note that other documents that are either in process or have been released, there will be information on the FDA website on the FSMA page. Other guidance documents include, for example, there's a supply chain program requirements and co-manufacturer supplier approval and verification guidance that came out a couple months ago. But other documents will also be posted as they're completed. Slide 38. So finally, some lessons learned. So now that we've been doing inspections under 117 for over a year now, we think that both sides, on the FDA side and industry, that we've learned a lot from each other. We've been getting a lot of positive feedback on how the inspections are going, but we've also gotten some feedback on areas for improvement on how we can conduct these inspections better. We've been deliberate in how we decided to roll out the training slowly and thoughtfully so that we could help try and ensure greater consistency in inspections and provide be more on-the-job training for investigators so that we're not just teaching the regulation, but how to really assess against it consistently, regardless of whether the facility is located in one division or another, or anywhere in the country for that matter. And it's important to understand that we're really using a different kind of inspection approach than FDA has used in the past. This rule, as you know, provides for a lot of flexibility in terms of implementation. So that really means as regulators, we have to understand a firm's operation pretty well before we can even begin to assess compliance. So that requires, as I mentioned before, a more cooperative approach, looking at a system and not focusing on the small things, but sort of looking at the big picture and what matters most from a public health perspective. And as we continue along the staggered compliance dates for these smaller facilities as we go, there's an even greater need for education and outreach while we regulate. Slide 39, please. Okay, so here's a glimpse of what PC inspections look like to date. The numbers here are changing daily, so just kind of giving you a snapshot. And do keep in mind, these are not specific to just acidified food processors. We don't have a whole lot of data yet on the acidified food front, but this is kind of giving you a snapshot of all PC inspections and the breakdown. So you can see here, we've done well over 500 what we call the CGMP inspections or limited scope inspections, and over 180 full scope preventive controls inspections. And so if you look at out of that 182 full PC inspections, the breakdown for domestic and foreign, you can see we've done about 131 domestic, 51 foreign. And if you look at the final inspection classifications, which are on the bottom of the slide, OAI, or official action indicated, is the final inspection classification we use for when a 43 was issued and reg action may be warranted. You can see it only constitutes about 10 out of the 182, so roughly about 5%. And the bulk of those in that OAI category, I can mention are for cause, what we call for cause inspections, meaning they were in response to a contamination event or outbreak investigation. In terms of VAI, or voluntary action indicated, these are situations when deviations were significant to warrant a 43. So a 43 was issued, but we expect a firm's corrections will resolve the problems without further action. So you can see here 42 out of the 182 fell into this VAI category. So that's around 23%. And finally, the NAI category, which is the no action indicated, are situations when there may have been some discussions during an inspection, but at closeout there was no 43 issued, and so generally everything was in compliance. And so you can see here 130 out of 182. So that's the bulk of the inspections. About more than 70% had no 43 issued. Slide 40, please. Okay, so again, keep in mind the data that I kind of went over is not specific to acidified food processors, but more PC inspections at large. But if we look at the top citations for what I called OAI and VAI situations where a 43 was issued, we can see the first three sites here are related to sanitation. We have employee practices or cleaning or sanitation. That would be part of the sanitation prevent that may be related to control of an environmental pathogen hazard. Then the next three sites are actually related to GMPs. So you can see here personnel practices, plant maintenance, sanitary operations during manufacturing. So despite how complex this regulation can seem, 3 out of these top sites we're seeing are related to GMP issues. And the last preventive control site here is related to when a hazard is actually identified, but for some reason the controls in place were either not identified or were lacking in terms of how they're being implemented. So, so these are the top citations. And slide 41, I think I'll hand it back over to Omar so we can discuss opportunities for improvement.
Thank you, Priya. So in the last slides, I just want to summarize a little bit what we have been presenting about some of the areas for improvement. I think that's a slide summarizes the key areas that inspectors and sometimes when we visit plants, we see most of the cases. There are areas for improvement within sanitation programs, the maintenance of processing and production records. As we said, the scheduled process records also can be improved. Now with the new with FSMA regulations, it's very advisable for facilities to reassess the hazard analysis to identify what are the hazards that they have through it in their processes. Verification procedures related to sanitation. In some of the areas for improvement mainly related to records. And as we move from and transition to preventive control, we are going to see more and more how we are developing these new food safety plans. At this point, I think this is all we have for our presentations. We would like at this point with Priya and I to start taking some of the questions that we have and see if we can address them. Amy?
Well, thank you both so much. We have a number of questions, and thank you to everyone in the audience for emailing them in. Our first question is for Priya. It says FDA guidance document mentions that if an acidified food ingredient is used in the formula, the finished product is automatically considered acidified. Is this still true based on current FDA understanding?
Can you repeat that question one more time?
Certainly. FDA guidance document mentions that if an acidified ingredient is used in a formula, the finished product is automatically considered acidified. Is this true based on current FDA understanding?
And I guess the guide we're talking about here is this a question about the food hazards guide I mentioned?
Let me interrupt if you don't mind. An acidified ingredients are really low acid ingredients or acid ingredients. So an acidified product will be a finished product, correct? Maybe that's what the question meant.
Yes, if the person who asked that could, thank you.
Yep.
Let's see. Next question is, what magnitude of pH shift determines whether a food is acid or acidified?
I don't mind taking that one. Actually, it's not the magnitude, it's the fact that we are having a finished equilibrium pH below 4.6. And we would like to see, remember, all these pH meters, they do have a variation, and you have to understand that when you're measuring a pH value and you said it's 4.3, you may have a 4.3 plus minus 0.05, plus minus 0.1. It depends on the instrument. So that's part of the quality program. You have to ensure that you have a value below 4.6. We usually start getting a little bit antsy when it's 4.4. We would like to see some room for safety there. So there is no really magnitude in itself, it's the finished equilibrium pH. The finished equilibrium pH is the pH of all the components of the product. It can happen quickly after the mixing and final preparation, or it may take days. It depends.
Thank you. What is the basis for the 10% rule for non-acid ingredients?
There is no such a rule. We use rule of thumbs based on experience, but that's not part of any regulation per se. The regulations, the actual regulation say that you can have low ingredient as long as that ingredient doesn't substantially change the pH of the whole formulation. So this is something for a processing authority to evaluate.
Does FDA consider water a low acid ingredient?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would have to refer back. I don't know if Omar can answer that question, but I'd have to refer
traditionally, back. Yes, traditionally has been considered a low acid ingredient. Now, however, in some formulation, you add water in such a low amount that it doesn't change substantially the pH of the rest of the formulation. Okay, so you may consider that that's the addition of water in those cases that is low enough, it doesn't change the rest. But yeah, water is considered a low acid food, yeah.
Under what conditions do the low acid and acidified requirements apply to dietary supplements?
In what way do they apply to dietary supplements? I guess, I mean, if this question is asking about how those would apply under the preventive controls rule, I'm not sure how that would, they would be separate. We would be looking at, under 117, it would really, if you're talking about a food that's, an acidified food that's now subject to 117, they would still have to, have a food safety plan, which includes a written hazard analysis and all the components that would be relevant in the food safety plan based on that operation. So how the dietary supplement piece ties into this question.
Yeah, maybe we need to ask for clarification. I am not aware of any dietary supplement that falls into a low acid food. There's a completely different regulations, yeah.
Okay. Is continuous recording required to prove compliance of meeting CCPs at all times, or is a periodic manual check acceptable?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I can take a stab at it from a PC perspective, and I guess Omar, if you want to add on the acidified food front, I mean, I know that for there's no specific requirement for continuous monitoring, but it has to be frequent enough to ensure control of whatever the hazard is, that we're trying to control. So even though there's, it may come down to, what equipment is in place, but at the end of the day, the preventive controls regulation provides flexibility for frequency so long as it's appropriate to control the hazard. So if there's a justification that can be made that monitoring at this frequency is sufficient to provide that control, I think it would need to be, it would be helpful to provide that if this issue came up during an inspection, that there was, some justification for why that frequency is so.
Yes, that's correct. I would like to just emphasize the word justification for the frequency, and also for the not only for the frequency of monitoring, but also for the frequency of verification. Sometimes the verification does not have a justification that is robust enough to guarantee safety, or to, that is associated with safety.
Okay. Why were LACF microhazards exempt from FSMA while acidified microhazards were not?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think, there's some thinking that perhaps it was an oversight, but, at the end, what it comes down to is that there isn't such an exemption for acidified foods. So, your guess is probably as good as mine, but.
Well, the thermal process, remember the low acid canned foods go through a very, very, very hard thermal process that is, in theory, is trying to destroy 12D, that would be 12 logs of the spores of Clostridium botulinum. So we're talking about very high temperature and pressure. We don't have that type of processing on acidified foods. We don't destroy all the spores. So really, we don't probably have in food processing a thermal process that is harder than the one that we apply to low acid canned foods.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I want to produce a cold filled beverage which will have preservatives in the recipe. Do I still require a process authority to create a process schedule?
You need to have somebody review it to see where it fits. Which kind of food is this? Is that within acidified food? Is this low acid food? It may be exempt from both of them. Somebody with some knowledge has to review that formulation and process.
Yeah, and I was just going to add.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to add also there's a resource on the FDA website. It's on the same place where Omar had noted the slide on requirements for LACF and acidified processors, where there's information to help try and see which box it kind of fits into, as you just mentioned.
Next question, what is the focus of FDA inspections on acidified foods restricted to CFR 117 or CFR 114? Yeah,
so So preventive controls inspections under 117. So as I mentioned during the presentation, there's, the scope is going to be kind of varied right now with, some of the inspections will be, more focused on the GMP requirements, the updated GMPs with, a broad overarching assessment of what controls may be in place. So if there are chemical allergen types of hazards, kind of looking broadly at those. And then there are also inspections that are what we call the full scope inspections, where we would be looking at all of the written programs and procedures within a food safety plan, from the hazard analysis, through all of the preventive controls that may be applicable. So those full scope inspections would take a little bit longer because it's more complex, and there would be a little bit more information that the investigator would have to review and assess. But those are generally the types of inspections and what they'd be looking at. And again, supply chain is also one piece of that under a full scope inspection. I'm looking at if there are any hazards that are being controlled by a supplier prior to receipt. So.
Okay, and we have a couple questions on violations. What is the basis for ranking the violations? Is there a decision tree for the inspectors to follow?
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, that ranking tool I mentioned is really just an internal tool that our investigators use, an electronic system to capture some of the key data points during an inspection. And so the system actually has these ranking tools as part of that. We've also provided some additional information on what criteria, what to think about in terms of ranking. Again, it's really just to help inform what that final inspection classification would be. So, for example, if there's a monitoring procedure that's not included as part of a preventive control, or there's an important piece of a preventive control missing in a written program. But if in practice, the facility appears to have that hazard under control, and there's monitoring going on, and there are other records that can establish that those controls are actually in place, the investigator, even though in and of itself it may be sort of a major type of ranking, it may be considered less significant from a public health standpoint, because that control is actually it's a starting point. It's not really anything that's kind of out there, but it's just some criteria and some instructions for the field and kind of how to look at these observations, because we know it goes back to the one size fits all doesn't work here, because we have to really look at a system and what controls are in place. So I hope that helps.
Are lacto-fermented foods considered separately from acidified foods?
Yes. Short answer.
Okay, great. Are electronic records permitted for process controls, i.e. electronic record temperature instead of chart recorders?
I can speak to on the PC side. There's nothing saying that you can't have electronic records, so long as they are able to be accessible, and that if during an inspection those need to be retrieved so that they can be reviewed as appropriate. So as long as they can be made available, the format is whatever is either way is fine, hard copy or electronic, as long as it can be made available during an inspection.
I'm sorry, there is also, let me add, probably you can clarify that, Priya. There is another portion that is Title 21 CFR Part 11 that is electronic records, correct? That describe what the FDA expects of those electronic records, especially in the maintenance and record keeping.
Yes.
Okay, and I have the clarification on the dietary supplement question. She says the question is about low acid and acidified food regulations. She knows that dietary supplements are exempt from 117. And the question is, has FDA enforced regulations against liquid dietary supplements?
Yeah, I'm really not sure on the liquid dietary supplements. I'd have to, you know, if there's a particular one we're talking about, but, you know, there are dietary supplement regulations that, you know, if it's a finished product, dietary supplement manufacturer would have to comply with. So, yeah, so, and again, the exemption, you know, for preventive controls under 117 is really if the dietary supplement manufacturer is in compliance with that, you know, with the dietary supplement regulation. So keep that in mind. That exemption applies if they're actually in compliance with the other applicable regulation.
Thank you. Are inspectors using the acidified guidance document that was pulled a couple of years ago for inspections?
Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I could probably follow up on that and see what they're using currently during acidified food inspections. I don't want to provide wrong information, so I can check and find out.
Let's see. Is there a formal procedure for assessing initial or raw pH? Specifically, could pH be immediately measured, or should the system be given time to come to equilibrium?
Do you want me to take that one, Priya?
Sure.
So the raw pH refers to all the ingredient that you have without any acidification or acid that you add to it. As a matter of fact, that depends again on how much the acid ingredients are going to drop the pH of the low acid ingredient. Again, there is not a simple answer because there may be a small amount of low acid food or ingredients, or maybe large ones. It's especially an issue when we are talking about low acid food ingredients that are in particulate forms, that, you know, where the transfer and the movement of pH in order to drop the pH in the overall finished product takes longer. So the answer, it depends.
Okay, we have time for one final question, and this is back to dietary supplements. Someone else asked, are they exempt from 117?
Yeah, so if they're a finished product manufacturer, yes, I think there's been some confusion about dietary supplement ingredient manufacturers. Ingredient manufacturers would be subject to 117. The finished product dietary supplement manufacturer would not be subject to the preventive controls requirements in 117.
All right, thank you both very much for your time today, answering our questions at the end of the webinar. And to those of you whose questions we did not get to, I apologize that we have run out of time. And I thank everyone for attending. If you have any questions of us, please feel free to email the link in your GoToWebinar meeting invitation. And have a great afternoon. And thanks again to Omar and Priya both for such a great presentation. Have a great day.
Thank you.